We welcome everybody who's joined us for this special public lecture in Women's Month, Women in Leadership, a Collective and Individual Journey. And this is our 4th annual public lecture by our registrar during Women's Month, celebrating women in academic leadership. But before I introduce the speaker, I'm going to ask that we commence this lecture by observing a moment of silence for those who've suffered, in some cases have died, from the unacceptable brutality of gender-based violence and femicide. Thank you. Now, if you've joined this this evening, you will already know, I think, that Professor Adéle Moodly is the Registrar of Rhodes University. What you might not know is that she's also an alumnus of this university, having studied here from 1985 through to 1988. The eldest of 4 siblings, she has 2 sisters and a brother. Adéle ascribes her achievements and her career trajectory to the values that her parents instilled in her and her siblings as children. With a career of more than 30 years in education, Professor Moodly started her working life as a high school teacher and then a college lecturer before joining Walter Sisulu University, where she worked for 20 years, rising through the ranks to become head of her department and deputy dean of her faculty. She then spent 3 years at the University of Fort Hare as an associate professor and deputy dean in the Faculty of Education, before finding her way home again to Rhodes University as registrar from the 1st of October 2017, in a way just in time to settle in properly before the pandemic arrived. She has extensive experience in academic leadership roles, including at Saudi Arabian University during a sabbatical period. Adéle has written broadly on the topic of higher education, covering areas of teaching and learning, quality assurance, and leadership. She remains research active as a senior administrator and is currently affiliated as an adjunct professor to the Rhodes University Business School. She has successfully in the past supervised master's and PhD students in the field of education, as well as MBA students. Her recent publications focus on the issues of women in higher education leadership and university governance. Outside of her professional CV, Adéle is a mother to an adult son and is married to a supportive and loving husband who came pre-packaged with a 2nd son and a daughter when he married Adéle. Earlier this month, Professor Moodly was celebrated by colleagues in the Registrar's Division for being an inspiring leader and a role model for all humans for rising above adversity with grace. Due to current personal circumstances, Adéle has not been able to be part of a hybrid public lecture as we've been moving to of late, that includes a face-to-face component. But she's indicated that next year, if she finds the courage to take on a 5th public lecture, the format will be different to tonight. In presenting this lecture series, Professor Moodly hopes to encourage women towards trajectories of leadership, to focus attention on the unacceptable scourge of gender-based violence and femicide in our society, and to motivate girl children and young women to lead. So it is my great pleasure to pass the microphone to Professor Adéle Moodly.
Thank you, Professor Clayton, and greetings to everyone this evening. If you will permit me, I will share my screen. So this evening, I have the pleasure to present my 4th public lecture at Rhodes University, and the title of which is Women in Leadership, a Collective and Individual Journey. And as part of my introductory remarks, if you will permit me, I'd like to acknowledge the Vice-Chancellor, the Deputy Vice-Chancellor, members, the two Deputy Vice-Chancellors here present this evening, members of the university, academic and administrative staff, as well as my colleagues, students, alumni, members from other higher education institutions here present this evening, as well as my close family and friends. And I thank you for joining me in this lecture here this evening. And as has been indicated, I apologize that it is not a hybrid approach, but hopefully next year it will be different. I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank the Rhodes University for the support that I've received and continue to receive during this journey. And I'd like to thank my team in the Registrar's Division and to indicate my gratitude to them for all the support that I have been receiving through this personal journey. I'd also like to say that it's important that we do acknowledge the very marginalized group of LGBTQI+, the LGBTQI+ community, and that we do need to acknowledge that gender is non-binary, as well as acknowledge that we all have the freedom and the right to identify as we wish. And it is as such that many of us identify as women, and even in identifying as women, we do not diminish the rights of anyone else to identify as they wish. I just want to try and clear something on my screen before I go on, because it is impacting on my ability to see all my notes. So if you just bear with me for a short while, I'm going to just maybe stop my screen for a while just to see if I can improve on what I am doing. Just give me a short period of time, please. Just want to close something. I open, just hold on. I'm sharing the wrong screen. All right. I apologize for that. So what I found is that I have to put off my video, unfortunately, otherwise there are some, the screen is interfering with my ability to present. So my apologies that I am switching off my screen. So in terms of my acknowledgements, I have covered this particular slide, and I'd like to move on to the next slide and talk a little bit about Rhodes University and Women's Month. And I think it's important that I acknowledge that when I joined Rhodes University, my first experience of the month of August was rather different to what I had previously experienced elsewhere. And in saying so, I wish to state that we can never not speak about or speak out against gender-based violence and femicide and the marginalization of those who identify as women, and that we cannot ignore that gender is non-binary. There is a continued perpetuation of gender-based violence and femicide against women, and the marginalization of those within the LGBTQI+ community. Our society continues to reflect intolerance and a lack of an inclusive culture, and I add to the voices that call for an end to such oppression and marginalization. We should do more in this regard. I also identify as a woman and wish to acknowledge women's struggles and achievements. For me, this month is not only about focusing the spotlight on the marginalization and oppression, but also to commemorate and acknowledge women. We are resilient, we are strong, and we will occupy the spaces that for many centuries have been the domain of men only. Women's Month is an opportunity, in the words of Indra Nooyi, for keeping society's inequities in the spotlight and for supporting women as they maneuver in tough careers. In offering this public lecture, I hope to add to this space. And I would also like to acknowledge my team in the Registrar's Division. There is a picture on the left-hand side of the screen of the team. And also like to mention that this year we had, as per usual, an annual Registrar's Division's Women's Day seminar, which was held on the 10th of August. And our guest speaker was our very own Suzette Flanagan, who spoke about the effect of horses on well-being. And this is one way in which we acknowledge the women in our division, as well as at the same time recognize women's strengths in adversity and in commemoration of women and girl children who continue to experience the injustices of a patriarchal society. And then I'd just like to also briefly talk about Rhodes University and the advancement of women. Rhodes University has much to be proud of. Just recently in 2021, the Senate and Council made the decision that those who occupy leadership positions at the executive level at this institution will no longer lose their title of professor, but would retain such titles. This was a historical step for Rhodes as a whole, but more importantly for women who have been marginalized in the academic space. The struggle for women, especially towards professorships, is a particularly difficult one, given the responsibilities that women are expected to carry in our predominantly patriarchal society. Earning such a title is a huge achievement. I thank Rhodes for this historical decision, and I am certain that it can only add value and academic gravitas to the university and leadership. In terms of the advancement of women, of the executive, the registrar, that is myself, and the DVC academic and student affairs are women, as is the director in the office of the Vice-Chancellor. Of the academic leadership, though there is still much to be done at the level of dean, where 5 men out of 6 are deans, there are currently 6 women as deputy deans out of a total of 8. This bodes well for women in academic leadership, and I am confident that going forward, there will be an increase in the number of women as deans. At the level of directors, 8 of 10 are women. In the Registrar's Division, all managers are women. The majority of our students are women, and more women than men have graduated each year over the past few years. Rhodes University is setting a trend that challenges the notions of gendered spaces and the dominance of patriarchy and associated oppressive practices. Rhodes must continue to do so. I'd also just like to focus a little bit on gender-based violence and femicide in terms of a national context. Sadly and tragically, there continues to be an increase in gender-based violence and femicide in our country. And those of you who have perhaps listened to me before would know that I enjoy reading the Sunday Times, and I often quote from the Sunday Times, as I do again this year. So there has been reported recently in the Sunday Times that quarterly crime statistics released in June 2022 for January to March of this year show murders of women rose 17.5% year on year, with 898 women killed in the period. Rapes increased 13.7%, with 10,818 reported cases. And writer after writer in the Sunday Times, and I've put their names down, continue to associate gender-based violence and femicide with the inequalities of a predominantly patriarchal society. It is for this and a number of other reasons that I encourage and support women towards and within spaces of leadership, in challenging and debunking views of women and girl children as inferior and subservient. Our government and general society must act to stop patriarchy and its associated oppressive practices. As more women take up spaces of leadership beside men, and at times may outnumber men in these spaces, we must use these positions of power and influence towards a more just and equal society, obliterating the scourge of GBVF and other forms of injustice as perpetuated against minority groups, women and girl children. It is the physical presence of women in positions of authority, I believe, that sends out the strongest message. We are here because we are capable and competent. In being here, we represent all women. All women are deserving of the acknowledgement and respect. We have a voice, and we will assert ourselves to challenge those who continue to disrespect and devalue women and girl children. I've put up a photo or a picture that has been taken again from the Sunday Times in an article that was written by Nick Dahl, and I will come back to the picture. And the issue I'd like to briefly touch on here is the enfranchisement of women. And it may be something that we take for granted, but Black people in general and white women did not always have the right to vote. In an article, Nick Dahl states that amongst the first South Africans to call for equal rights for women was author Olive Schreiner. In 1892, in the Cape House of Assembly, there was a call to enfranchise women. The response was cheers and laughter, with traditional sayings and scripture quoted condemning the proposal out of hand. Dahl cites Professor Cheryl Walker, who quotes John X. Merriman, the last Prime Minister of what was known as the Cape Colony before the formation of the Union of South Africa in 1910, at the time as saying, "Women's counsel and brandy are two capital things, but you must use them cautiously." Just to think of putting women's counsel and brandy in the same sentence in itself is something that is very concerning. So just to continue, in 1930, white women were granted the power to vote despite the objections of senators such as T.C. Visser and reluctant acceptance of the likes of C.J. Langenhoven, who argued that the bill was a movement away from the home, as a woman who occupied a professional position kept a man out of a position, shirked the responsibility of marriage, and prevented a man from marrying because he did not earn the income which would make it possible for him to marry. Though these senators were in the minority and the Women's Enfranchisement Act was passed, it is a disturbing thought that such patriarchal sexist views are still present or prevalent in our society today. Sadly, this act, though it signaled a move away from sexism, was an indication of the rise of racism. This part of South Africa's history is aptly told in the tartlets baked by the women of the so-called colored community, who sadly fell for the false promises of Hertzog, a former Prime Minister of South Africa from 1924 to 1939, who at the time was courting the colored vote in lieu of the upcoming general election. He had promised to extend the vote to white and colored women if he was re-elected in 1929. A tartlet known as the Hertzoggie to this day, it's made of coconut and jam, was baked by colored women in his honor. When he reneged on his promise by only enfranchising white women, arguing that he could not give colored women the vote as not all were civilized, unlike white women, and also that this would open the doors for native women, another tartlet known as the Tweegefriekie, also translated as two-facedness, was baked with two distinct colors, garish brown and pink. This is also still baked to this day. And I'm not certain how many of us who have eaten or seen these tartlets were familiar with this history. To an extent, these goodies reaffirm the significance of baked goods as historical, religious, cultural symbols. Next time you buy or you bake a hertoggie or a tweegefrietjie, you may appreciate its symbolism a little bit more. Sadly, it took a further 64 years before all South African men and women had the right to vote. So many may ask the question, is it a happy Women's Day? Is it a happy Women's Month? And many argue that there is nothing happy about the month of August for women. And here I'd like to cite Lindiwe Mazibuko, who also writes for the Sunday Times, in an article which she laments, how we cannot find ourselves every year commemorating the iconic leaders of the 1956 Women's March while bemoaning women's socioeconomic deprivation and crying out against the daily acts of gender-based violence. Mazibuko paints a sad and pathetic picture of the impact of the COVID pandemic on women's economic participation, quoting statistics that reflect that women's economic participation has yet to recover to pre-pandemic levels, while men's had recovered by March 2021. She cites a report by the World Economic Forum that states that it will take 132 years at the current pace of change to achieve gender equity in the areas of economic participation and opportunity, educational attainment, health and survival, and political empowerment. So if you look at these areas, this is rather extremely disconcerting as it paints a bleak picture of access and empowerment of and for women in key sectors of our society. Continuing in an article, Mazibuko raises that whereas with the run-up to 2020, gender parity was forecasted within 100 years, with the 18 months of the pandemic, we have squandered 30 years progress. She cites Harambe in stating young women's triple exposure to poor economic outcomes in the form of job insecurity. Women are more likely to be exposed to financial shocks. Women have the least access to economic interventions, and she cites the Unemployment Insurance Fund as an example. And women face additional burdens of household duties and unpaid care work that exacerbate economic poverty with time poverty. She further states that all 5 of the best ranking countries in the WEF Global Gender Gap Report have a woman head of government. So I looked at the report and I identified 3 with women heads. Maybe I didn't have time to look at the others, but New Zealand, Finland, and Norway were 3. If you note, 2 of them are Scandinavian countries, and none of them are on the African continent. The point Mazibuko is making is that it's clear that one of our most important priorities for gender equality must be women's political representation. And this, to an extent, is also reflected in the literature. And I'm not going to cite too much of the literature this evening because we simply do not have that time. But if you look at a recent publication of 2022 by Barkhuizen and Masekane, together with van der Sluis, they state that even though more women are entering the South African professional job market, the challenges to obtain leadership or senior executive positions continue. Women only hold 23.5% senior management positions and 34.5% of executive positions. And again, they confirm, and for me, this is also important that we note that it was also mentioned in literature as well as in the Sunday Times. The majority of gender inequality practices in organizations result from our societies. Society perpetuates women's marginalization by fostering oppressive beliefs and values that continue to be unjust to women, with the predominance of men in our social, political, cultural, and economic spheres tending to aggravate this. They go on to state that a more significant representation of women leaders can improve women's self-perceptions of career progression and boost self-confidence in their performance in male-dominated environments. I concur with this. Significantly for me, they cite research which indicates that it is possible that increasing the number of women in senior leadership positions will help to reduce incidents of sexual harassment, and that companies with a higher representation of female directors experienced less female harassment. So though my own research does not explore this aspect of women in leadership, I do again reaffirm that women need women as role models, and that women in positions of leadership, together with our male counterparts, must exercise our agency and positional power to amplify the voices calling for social justice for women, girl children, and those who are marginalized. So now I'd like to move on to the area of the paths and experiences of 4 women who are women in leadership, in the highest levels of leadership in higher education, but as DVCs, Deputy Vice-Chancellors, as well as Vice-Chancellors, whom myself and my research colleague, Dr. Noluthando Tony, who was also a friend, undertook. And as part of our research project, I'd also like to indicate that we have interviewed 6 men in leadership. We've also interviewed 13 women, 7 who hold the position of Vice-Chancellor and Deputy Vice-Chancellors, and 6 at the position of Deans and Deputy Deans, whom we have engaged with in terms of written engagement as well. So just to share a little bit on the profile of the participants, for the sake of anonymity and confidentiality, the participants are A to D, and we're all in the age groups 50 to 65. 1 declared her marital status as married, 1 as single, and the others chose not to share this information. 2 had 2 children each, with 1 having a single child and 1 having none. And most of them were in middle management positions in the early 2000s and took up executive leadership positions as DVCs or VCs in the period 2017 to 2019. So the areas of commonality were that all the women were in the age group 50 to 65 and had come into positions of DVCs and VCs from the period 2017 to date. All were in middle management from the early 2000s for a number of years, holding various positions within middle management, with at least 1 following the trajectory of Dean, DVC, and VC. And I'd like to point out that I think it's important that we note that it's not always the trajectory, Dean, DVC, VC. People come into positions of leadership, including women, from various other trajectories. And though I'm not concentrating on that this evening, I have various publications that also speak to that. So what was significant for these women? And I'd like to share a few themes that came out of the conversations with them. I think one that's very important to me, and one that one doesn't necessarily find reflected that much in the literature, is that the trajectory of leadership starts off at a young age. So we've had the women shared. For example, participant C indicated that she was a monitor, she was a prefect at school, and this grew to other positions of leadership such as deputy principalship, onwards to university positions of leadership at middle management level. And participant B also shared that she was a leader at school, though interestingly, she stated that school leadership positions found her. She had never thought of herself as a leader. And she credits her university student leadership trajectory to her school leadership foundation, even though this was not a conscious decision to be a leader at school. She had captained the sports team, was involved in student societies where she was exposed to leadership development. Still, she did not realize that it was a significant part of her being, as she puts it. But she stated that when she looked back, she realized that these roles were raising the awareness within her that this was leadership, and with training came a deeper awareness of a body of knowledge around leadership. Those early years laid the groundwork, though still at the time she did not identify with having leadership capabilities, that she was a leader within herself. And I think the second one that stood out for me that came up was that holding positions of responsibility contributes towards the development of an identity of leadership. And this was shared by participant B, who indicated that she held various positions of responsibility within the university. She was a coordinator. She became involved in broader university, the broader university sector through projects. And it was only through that type of participation that she developed a leadership identity. And sometimes one must also consider that these are not, these positions are voluntary positions at times. They are not positions that one has to fill. It's roles that one can play and voluntarily participate in terms of becoming or towards a trajectory of leadership. I think another important or significant theme that came up is, and this comes up in the literature all the time, women are supported towards leadership. One participant indicated that it was an astute head of department that gave her opportunities. And she gave an example of the timetable coordination, which taught her skills, including negotiating with people. And these were the types of support that developed her leadership. For participant D, there were also interventions in the form of conference attendance and presentations as such. And these brought also opportunities for exposure and collaboration towards strengthening her career trajectory as she gained a more global perspective of her field, becoming an associate professor in the early 2000s and a deputy vice-chancellor thereafter. And another significant matter that came up, which also is constantly reflected in the literature, is the need for mentors and role models. So participant B indicated that her journey to leadership started when she decided to become an academic. She had a male supervisor who was her mentor. And at the time, she indicates there were not many Black women in her field, so that she could engage with them or to understand the workplace. So her journey was for her a difficult one. There were not many Black women as role models, and there were not many mentors in her chosen field, but she was determined to become an academic. I think the one that I've put up now in terms of ethical values is not just specific to women or women in leadership, but ethical values in terms of leadership in general. I think this also comes through in a lot of work around and the body of knowledge around ethical values. And I'd like to share here what participant C had to say. She indicated that it was her humble beginnings that made her the woman she is today. And these humble beginnings have taught her to be assertive, hardworking, empathetic, firm, and steadfast of values. These values were learned from her background, and she cited 3 key values besides hard work. It was integrity, and I'll speak a little bit more about integrity later, dependability, and respect. What also came up as significant and also is reflected in the literature is that leadership is not always planned. Participant A indicated that nothing for her has ever been planned. Though her career was not haphazard, what drives her are issues of humanity and working with knowledge. Working in academia is an opportunity to use knowledge to make a difference. Participant B also indicated that none of the leadership positions she held were planned. In fact, she described herself as a reluctant leader and that she did not realize that she was a leader. It was the Vice-Chancellor who had encouraged her to consider a position of executive leadership. Participant B had initially not thought of herself as a leader. Around 2012, she started aspiring towards positions of higher education leadership. This was as she was working within a university environment where matters of transformation and policy were being addressed at the time. And it was an environment that was created where she could understand the milieu and the roles of a vice-chancellor. And I think that is important. The environment in itself was created, and that was created by the leadership within that environment. And that gave her an opportunity to understand the environment of higher education, as well as the role of a vice-chancellor. So this gave her the courage to consider such a role and to see herself in such a position. With the fallist movement of 2015 and 2016, if we can recall, that was the time of violent protest or protest action across universities, with fees must fall and roads must fall, etc. And the protest action that accompanied that movement, she made the assumption that such jobs were for men and that she did not want to find herself in that space. That is a space of leadership during a time of violent protests. She did not want to be terrorized. She acknowledged that men who held such positions at the time were experiencing a harrowing time. And this is also reflected in literature by, for example, Janssen in 2017. And at the time, she was not ready nor willing to put herself in such a position. However, it was in attending leadership courses as offered by HERS South Africa, and this is a higher education leadership academy, that she started planning for a career in higher education leadership. And I've said this before, we mustn't think of leadership only in a context of crisis. Our higher education milieu is not perpetually in a state of crisis. And sometimes we get caught in that trap of thinking of leadership and associating it with a state of crisis. And it's important that we move away from that form of thinking. So the other area that we had a conversation on was what were the barriers or challenges that women experienced. And one theme that came up, and which comes through the literature and is also why we have these forms of lectures today, is patriarchy and male dominance. One participant described how her male counterparts with fewer qualifications were offered permanent employment, where she, with a master's degree at the time, battled to get a permanent appointment. Her environment was not particularly enabling to women, being male-dominated, and she left that workplace as soon as an opportunity presented itself. Yet she experienced similar challenges in a new environment. Not only was her workspace a difficult one, it was male-dominated, but her environment was a challenge as well, as the place itself was reminiscent of the apartheid era. She was on her own, pursuing a PhD without a community of women in her field, as she puts it, with whom she could work and who could encourage her. It was just her ambition, her drive, and it was a struggle. As she worked and read towards a PhD, her first supervisor was a white male who met her once, and when she told him what she wanted to do, he responded that she was ambitious and that it was not going to happen. She got discouraged and she did not tell her dean that she was no longer going to pursue her studies. Her dean, a woman, somehow discovered that she had become discouraged, engaged her, listened to her challenges, picked up the phone and contacted her counterpart at the institution where she was registered and got her a female supervisor. Having a female supervisor who understood what she wanted to do was a key factor to her successful completion of her studies. Otherwise, as she stated, I would have given up. And I think the second theme that comes up in terms of barriers and challenges may seem to overlap with the issues around patriarchy and male dominance, but I wanted to separate it and also highlight it because of what some of the participants mentioned under this particular theme that came up. Participant A indicated that at the time when she was in middle management, she managed teams of men, and she indicated that there was always someone who undermined her. This was as a woman and not necessarily as a leader. However, she was not deterred. She addressed these matters in a non-confrontational way, treating persons with respect. As she indicated, you always want them to respect you back. She described herself as a gender activist and indicated that she used the platform that is her position to speak to the issues. Participant C also stated that she experienced being undermined as a woman, and in particular as a Black woman. Some examples she cited was the allocation of Black students only in a role as supervisor, as well as being excluded by language. Afrikaans was commonly used as a means of communication, both formally and informally. And another form of discrimination she experienced was lower salaries than male counterparts. And this made her realize that as a woman, you would always be at the bottom regardless of your portfolio. Participant C further shared that she worked well with men, but this came with a condition. As long as they got some benefits of some kind from that working relationship, it was fine. But when she became assertive, when she spoke up against things she did not like, the relationship was not good. Another challenge that was shared and also reflects in the literature continuously is the balance between family and career. And here I'm just going to focus on one participant's sharing. She indicated that she found the challenge of balancing family and career as well as emotional and physical challenges. However, she decided not to choose between the two, but to get all the help that she could in navigating these challenges. Other challenges that the participants shared were managing people issues and making firm decisions and finding the balance. And I think that can be a challenge to anyone in the field of leadership. How do you manage people and how do you make firm decisions and find the balance between the two? Learning to be assertive was also a further challenge. And this challenge, I think many women especially experience this as a challenge because assertiveness is viewed as predominantly a male characteristic. And once you are viewed as being assertive, it is almost as if you are trying to become or to take on male characteristics of leadership. And that's not true. Assertiveness in itself and finding the balance between assertiveness and being someone who is an inclusive leader, that is what we need in terms of leadership. Another experience that was shared is that in situations, one has to look at the positive side. One has to know how to turn something into an opportunity and not to panic. An interesting one that came up for me, something that I've not realized or actually thought of and I've not really seen reflected in the literature, and was shared by one participant B, was learning by watching or observing. And she shared that different leaders, she watched different leaders to see what she could learn. Her VC at the time was a male who could use his height and voice to command presence. As she was short and soft-spoken, she had to learn to use her voice more. She shared an experience where with students during the fallist protest actions, she would assert her authority in meetings through having students sitting at a table patterned in a circle with her standing in the middle, which gave her a sense of height. And I found that significant and interesting. And she also mentioned that it was exposure to great leaders in higher education rather than mentorship and reading that assisted her in her leadership journey. Other challenges that were mentioned or that had to be kept in mind was one has to work hard and keep your integrity. One has to make it difficult for people who want to bring you down, and you have to learn to be focused. Hold people accountable, but always be humane, be kind, do not compromise your integrity. Integrity comes up again. Decisions based on popularity are not sustainable and may compromise you in the end. So that is women speaking to their integrity, holding their grounds, and not giving into a popular decision, but having that difficulty and trying to keep their focus. What have they learned further? Support of family is important. That comes through the literature. Support at work is important. Making use of opportunities for exposure at the university level, both internally and externally. In other words, getting involved, not waiting for opportunities to come to you, but actually volunteering to participate and taking up opportunities when they come. And as participant D said, she had sheer determination. There has to be an inner drive. One cannot always look at the university and external drivers in order to motivate us on our trajectory. We have to have a form of inner drive. As participant D indicated, in the absence of mentors, it was a sheer determination to improve that drove her, together with the help of the dean. Another area that I focused on was, what were the positive experiences that women had? And this is some of which they shared, and I'm going to read directly off the slide. Being able to get challenging things done, putting together new structures within the work environment, and working collaboratively with people in it, that is within the new structures. That was a positive. Finding approaches other than face-to-face meetings to communicate, encourage, and motivate academics. And these forms took the approach of options of breakaways with HODs and deans to form a cohesiveness around the academic project, as well as writing letters to academic staff during the lockdown, which assisted giving direction and making sense for herself and others of what everyone was experiencing during the pandemic. And I think for me, that's also something that possibly I could learn from, that we write a lot of emails, and sometimes the letter writing gives a bit of a personal touch. Positive experiences also include affirmation, and this also came through in the participants' responses in terms of positive experiences. Being affirmed by people regarded as great in higher education was something that one participant found very positive. Affirmation is incredible. Working with international scholars and being invited to presentations and to apply for key roles, that's also a form of affirmation. Being acknowledged by being nominated for special awards was affirming. It also made one reflect deeply on what you're doing and your purpose. So affirmation came through very strongly, and I think it's one way of encouraging anyone towards leadership. Other positive experiences included being in the academic space. Being in this space presented opportunities which may not be presented in any other space. In the academic space, you have opportunities for conference attendance and participation. The academic space also allows for flexibility of not having to be at work all the time, but also having time to work from home without abusing the practice. Another positive experience was working with brilliant academics. It was a space, or it is a space of ideas and knowledge. And this includes that it is a space of students who have a very interesting way of making you look at life in a very different way. So in terms of the engagement with these women, I also asked the question, do you see yourself as a role model? Because the argument, or my perspective, is that when we aspire and achieve leadership positions of any form, we become role models to women and girl children. And these are some of the responses. Participant B indicated that she thought she had become a role model. She had initially thought of herself as a reluctant leader until she had taken up an upfront leadership role. A younger generation, particularly women, approach her and indicate that they have been able to learn from her. And younger women look at her approach follow her advice on literature, and they share literature with her as well. And participant C also shared very enthusiastically that, yes, of course I am. She is a role model. She spoke and identified herself as a role model for all women, not only Black women. She indicated that we are modeling as role models for men and young boys as well, that we are sharing the message of women's capabilities and competencies. Young people often send her messages of support, thanking her for her mentorship and her support. And even participant D indicated that she saw herself as a role model for young women, encouraging them and helping them to achieve their goals. So having shared this, I'd like to make a few concluding remarks on which I wish to end this public lecture. I still maintain that it is those in positions of power and influence who are the gatekeepers to women's pathways towards leadership. It is their responsibility to use their agency to encourage, support, and motivate women. To women, I also say, have the courage to use your agency. Be driven and work towards your goals. Don't be afraid to approach those in leadership to guide and mentor you. Ask for support and in return, give support. Remember, this is both an individual journey and a collective journey. Recognize that leadership is not only in the position to which you aspire, but the entire journey that you are on, driven by the decisions that you make. Learn, observe, read, and practice the ethical strategies of those who have achieved despite patriarchy and its oppressive culture. Your voice matters. You are capable. Do not give any person power over you. Just as these women have shared about their determination, do not be deterred. And on that note, I wish to thank everyone. Thank you.
Thank you ever so much, Professor Moodly, for the thought-provoking talk and for encouraging us women to use our voices, to rise above our adversities and to celebrate our achievements, as well as debunk myths that women are inferior. And further encouraging us to remember that many women, including yourself, got into leadership positions because of hard work and persistence. And through a journey traveled individually and sometimes collectively through the support of others. You have reminded us that we should act as role models for the girl child and young women who aspire to take up leadership roles and to stand for the marginalized groups. This is your 4th lecture, and I must applaud you for always giving only the best. And I would like people to give you a hand. I know they are doing that. Higher education is much richer because of your research on women in higher education leadership. So I would like to thank everyone who has traveled this journey with you and who have supported you through hard times and also through easier times, your family, your friends, and your colleagues. I thank everyone who's attending this virtual lecture this evening. Last but not least, I would like to thank the organizers of this virtual lecture. Thank you everyone for gracing this auspicious occasion. Have a good night. Thank you.
Thank you. Good night, everyone. Goodbye.